Yeah, off we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Carboni. Thank you for coming to this online session with Timothée Parrique. Timothée is a researcher in economics at the Faculty of Business and Economics of the University of Lausanne. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Clermont, Auvergne, and Stockholm University, called The Political Economy of Degrowth, 2019, and is the author of the book Slow Down or Die, The Economics of Degrowth, published in English in 2025. His current research project explores the idea of post-growth in Switzerland. Timothée, thank you very much for being here with us. I very much look forward to this talk, and I will just dive right into it. And I will ask you if a very simple question, but could you tell us how you define degrowth and how degrowth is different from post-growth, post-capitalism? This is in the introduction of Slow Down or Die, your book. You say that we should imagine degrowth as a transition to post-growth. So could you maybe say a bit more about that?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone. And yes, in the introduction, and I use these two definitions to structure the chapters, but I'm going to give you a little teaser of I've changed my mind since I wrote the book. So that's the cliffhanger is unbearable, but I'll still give you the definition I've built for the book. Degrowth is a concept of transition, so something that happens not infinitely, but going from one way, from a point A to a point B. So that's why it's an action concept. In the book, I define it as a downskilling of production and consumption to reduce ecological footprints, planned democratically in a way that is equitable while securing well-being. That definition is a bit long, but that's necessary to, let's say, theorize degrowth as a specific phenomenon that is a bit more sophisticated than your usual recession or any other form of imposed economic contraction. A criticism I've received from my fellow degrowth thinkers is that this definition is a bit too narrow. And so I just want to start by saying that degrowth, here I've taken the liberty of defining it as a transition strategy, but there are many people, including myself in the PhD thesis you've mentioned, that have also used degrowth as a critical theory. Because in my definition, the one I've given here, we don't really hear the critical theory. It's just a transition strategy. And of course, we don't hear also the utopia. So my choice was first to be like, well, let's divide, let's use degrowth as the transition strategy and post-growth as a utopia. And then you say I've evacuated perhaps the objection to growth, but it's very much present. So post-growth, so imagine we're starting from an economy with a massive ecological footprint. And so that needs to be downscaled. We've seen this, the concept of downskilling being so important. Downscaling is not only reduction, that is linear and infinite. Downscaling is just going from a societal metabolism that is ecologically unsustainable to one that is ecologically sustainable. And so post-growth, the definition that I give in the book is a steady state economy in harmony with nature, where decisions are made collectively and wealth is equitably shared, allowing us to prosper without growth. So in that sense, I mean, I like conceptual symmetry. So each definition of 5 points, kind of factual points. So degrowth is about downskilling, post-growth is about steady state, and then the 4 values of ecological sustainability, democracy, social justice, and well-being that here are adapted either as a worry, something to be concerned during a period of social ecological transformation, or a long-term goal. I'm just adding something because maybe some of you have read a fantastic article that was published last year by Yorgos Kallis and a team of growth critical scholar, which was called Postgrowth, the Science of Well-Being Within Planetary Boundaries. And that's a literature review of the growth critical field of research. And they're using the term post-growth as the kind of umbrella word to include objection to growth, degrowth, but also, donut economics, certain eco-socialist and post-capitalist theories. So there's also this double meaning, and that's where I changed my mind, because I think post-growth is not a very good utopian concept. We can discuss this after, but that's why, and I like you mentioned post-capitalism, that's the concept of my next book. So that's a concept I quite like. I feel post-capitalism, sorry, my mouth, as a utopian, it's more as a utopian power, a bit more than post-growth, because growth is an overly technical, so it's a good concept to criticize, to have a critical theory, and to organize a transition around. But post-capitalism as a concept just pointing to economic systems that are so radically differently organized that they could no longer be described as capitalist. So right now, in my current state of research, I use post-growth as this umbrella word. I use it as a synonym for growth critical theories to include everything that starts from a criticism of growth. And I use post-capitalism as another umbrella word that includes many different utopian concepts and theories.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And yes, I really like that you mentioned utopia. Maybe we can get to it towards the end of the session. And I will ask you another question. For now, I'll move on to asking you about this idea that degrowth as a transition and post-growth, now I'm feeling a bit self-conscious about which word to use, is about rethinking life, society. So not just economics, it's about reimagining, it's a shift in perspective. This is what you're saying, I think, in your book. And for instance, there are a few examples. You make points about the GDP being an inexact metric of progress, and especially an abstraction of nature, which I would love to hear a bit more about, if possible. The necessity of technology to be sustainable, accessible, useful, which I think is very topical in today's work, in the workplace. And you also say that we have to redefine prosperity. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about prosperity, about the solutions and methods that could be used to shift this ideology of growthism, if we will.
Yeah, that's the starting point of degrowth. And the one thing that got me very curious as an economist when I first encountered the concept in 2014, I think, is that it says that GDP and economic growth is not prosperity. And when you do this, it's like you're removing the most important line of code in modern economics. Like your usual economist cannot function if you remove that line of code, because they're like, well, if growth is not prosperity, then it means that businesses should not strive to maximize their profits, households should not strive to maximize their income, government should not strive to maximize their national income. It means the entirety of national accounting, the way we've been understanding it for a century, is not a good compass for development, for lack of a better word. And so this starting point, which I think was the very powerful impetus behind décroissance, the way the word emerged in France in 2002, was really to come and to unpack decades and decades of assumptions, buried assumptions in our collective imaginaries about the role that money and financial indicators play in everyday life. And that leaves us with a gap, which is quite dizzying, which is like, if we do not have that growth-based definition of prosperity, what how should we define prosperity instead? You know, which are, you know, questions historians, anthropologists, philosophers have been grappling for a very long time, but questions that, you know, economists are not too busy dealing with because they're too obsessed with the means of running a growth-based economy: full employment, price stability, international trade, public finance, all these the means, but not the fundamental needs. So that's what got me interested in degrowth in the first place. And then when you start from that, you're like, okay, well, but this changes everything. Like the very definition of, I mean, you've mentioned technology and technical progress. I mean, I think people don't really understand like how we measure when we say technological progress. When economists say technological progress, they don't mean like actual technologies, you know, like machines and AI and the web. They just mean anything that is improving productivity. There's something we call total factor productivity, which is basically the economic growth, the growth of production that cannot be explained by a proportional increase in factors of production. You increase hours of work and let's say, you know, the number of machines and buildings you have, but you have a bit more growth than before. That residual, we call it the solo residual, is productivity. That's technical progress. So even the very definition of something that sounds quite important in defining what prosperity is in a dynamic fashion is very much wired to this one goal that is just to be productive in terms of producing monetary values, meaning commodities that can be sold on the market, which is a very small part of the economy. I mean, the abstraction of nature, I love it. The fact that GDP was created a century ago, and now this week I'm actually reading the 2025 you know, there's this reform of national accounting. There's been a few ones since 1953, which was the year GDP was framed internationally at the United Nations. Basically, it gives like a shared manual for countries to calculate GDP in the same fashion. And now they've been changing it a few times, last time in 2008. And even reading the new version where they're trying to include what they call natural capital, nature, even the very notion of natural capital as a productivist bias, like natural capital. Nature is basically a factor of production waiting to be exploited, to be transformed into something that can be sold on the market. You see, that's growthism in action in our imaginary. The very relation we have with nature is tainted by this pervasive ontology we have, this ethos of growth. So yeah, unfortunately, nature is not present in national account. And so when you destroy it, then you don't see that value is actually being destroyed. And the very notion of added value, so gross domestic product is supposedly, you know, the aggregation of all added values in an economy during a period of time. That does not make the difference between the value that is genuinely added, you know, something that did not exist. Let's say we were all thirsty and there were no glass, and one day someone invented a way of making a glass. That's real value added. It's amazing. People love it. You can satisfy a need you could not satisfy before. But turning like a century-old tree that is producing countless ecosystem services into a luxury furniture that's gonna, you know, catch dust in the basement of, you know, someone's holiday home that is just being used 2 weeks a year. That's not value added. That's value subtracted. That's value removed. And the whole what scientists, natural scientists, have called the great acceleration, these increased rates of extractivism and of rejection of pollution that has contributed to global overshoot, has been precisely this. From an economic perspective, we celebrate it as added value, piling up more digits on our Excel sheet next to that, the little GDP row. Whereas in reality, and if you ask a natural scientist, for them it's just, no, you've destroyed ecosystems that we won't be able to repair. Sorry, I need to learn to make short responses. I'll work on it.
No, it's amazing. I mean, it's all fascinating and so much that I'm just writing everything down. So many things to say to this, but no, it was, and especially thank you for being clear and accessible to people that aren't economists in the audience like myself. I do have a lot to say about technology that goes back to utopia. So um, wait for it. And since you mentioned you talk about nature and this idea of the natural capital, I would love to hear more about another similar topic that I asked during another session we had on degrowth, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. And this is the idea that degrowth is often accused of imposing limits on people's free will. You can't earn more than this. You can't, that in the degrowth idea, for example, I'm thinking about Ingrid Robbins, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly, limitarianism. There's this idea that advocates for capping personal wealth. It's specifically against billionaires. And so this could be seen as imposing a limit on someone's free will. But then in your work, you say that these limits are actually already imposed on most people, most of us. For example, if you're on the minimum wage, you definitely can't fly a private jet every weekend. So I was wondering if maybe you could say a bit more about this idea of limit freedom in a degrowth society or post-growth society and how it's framed in your work.
Sure. There's the concept of self-limitation that I use, and I think it's the best text I can recommend is a book from Yorgos Kallis, which is called Limits: Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care, from 2019. And that's a very nice philosophical essay on basically the notion of freedom in an ecologically limited world. Because I'm an ecological economist, so the way I look at economies is from the perspective of a limited biocapacity, which is a bit of a dismal, starting point, I admit. But that's the fact. Energy, materials, ecosystem services, space, land, all of that is not infinite. And so regardless of what we do, all of this is rationed. I often say this, like, everything is rationed, because sometimes people say, oh, degrowth is pro-rationing, as if there was no rationing under, market capitalism. I mean, I'm not going to ask you guys to raise hand, but I doubt many people here have a Lamborghini. You don't have Lamborghinis, they're rationed by purchasing power. Not only purchasing power, also prestige and most probably just who you know, but many things. Expensive housing in London is rationed. You don't go in and queue, like, yes, maybe perhaps if that's well organized social housing, but on the private market, no, you vote with your wallet, and if you have a big wallet, you are first in the queue. So housing is being auctioned. And so I'm not free to live in a 200 square meter in downtown London. No, I don't have this. I cannot do it. Some people can. And I think in terms of political philosophy, it's interesting to ask, what different allocation systems, that's how we call it in economics. Some that are based on, market exchange, others on gift and reciprocity, or maybe on state distribution. Which one work and which one do not work? Maybe reciprocity under independent organization works well for organ donation and blood donation. And maybe just, vegetables and fruits on the local market works or allocated well enough through market exchange. But all of that is always moving. So I think people that tend to feel they're going to have their freedom limited tend to be the one that have been given extra freedom on the ecological budget of others. Sociologists, they call it the imperial mode of living. That's an important concept. And, when we see this ecological footprint and you calculate perhaps like the average ecological footprint in the UK, and that tells you like if everyone lived like someone in the UK, we would need like 2 to 3 planets. That means, but since people do have this footprint today and we only have one planet, it does mean that these resources are being taken either from other people, poorer people that don't have the power to defend their resources, notably in the global south, or future generation that cannot defend their resources because, they don't yet exist. The easiest people to exploit are the people that are not yet born. No one is defending them. And so degrowth, starting from an ecological reality check to be like, guys, our current volume of modes of production and consumption in high income countries are running an enormous ecological deficit. And so that's very concrete. When we say, people tell me this all the time, like, I would love to do like you, Tim, and, not fly and take the train to go to work or what, but I don't have the time. And so people, they want speed, but speed at what cost? So for you to accelerate right now, if you want to take the plane to go somewhere instead of, taking 1 or 2 days of slow travel, that acceleration costs energy. That energy you're going to burn in the plane, which you would have not burned in the train, is energy that won't be available for someone else today in the global south or in the future. Not having access to energy means that at some point in the world or in the future, someone will have to do something slower and in a more difficult fashion, because we today made the choice of being like, well, I've got the liberty of flying. It's legal. I can buy a ticket. So you see how somehow the market and the way nature is absent in the market and the way future generations are absent in the market can allow this massive resource grab from the global south and from the future. That I think is unfair. So you mentioned Ingrid Robbins and our concept of limitarianism, which I find revolutionary. To be like, look, it's just the too much of some in a limited world turns into the not enough of others. It's a zero-sum game. I know economists will tell you, no, because technical progress is making value added appear. Okay, fine. Maybe a bet on the margin. But we've seen if we have limited ecological budget, then it's a zero-sum game, which means we need to ask very difficult questions about resource allocation. And these questions would be difficult if we were living in a world where everyone has enough. That would still be politically difficult because, it's like, okay, who's getting more than others? But we live in a world where poverty remains and where poverty is on the verge of being made almost impossible to resolve because of all the environmental crises that are the consequences of these northern imperial mode of living. And so in this context, I think we need to urgently take a libertarian perspective and to connect these two challenge, the eradication of extreme poverty and the eradication of extreme wealth. Two phenomena that are connected because they happen on the same world with limited ecological budgets.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for, I think, mentioning this idea of, the speed is fascinating because it's so true that, I also try to take the train as much as possible. And I am aware that, I think I am, you probably are, but like when you do something academic, you have the freedom, the privilege of saying, I can spend a day on the train because I can, I'll do my readings, whereas other people don't have that privilege. So it is, I think, again, very topical. And again, it's also about how we experience work and how we experience the resources that we have. And to move on, just because I'm aware of time, we briefly touched on work, and I think it's absolutely it's another very fascinating topic in degrowth. So you, in your book, you mentioned David Graeber's bullshit jobs, and you then define emploi négatif, negative employment. So I was wondering, I was wondering if you could maybe tell us about this idea. I think it's negative employment in English.
Yeah, so it's not a huge concept. Bullshit job is a huge concept. What David Graeber did in his 2013 article and then in the 2018 book was just absolutely massive. And I think it connects to the entire discussion here on forms of value. We've talked about the real value added. So things that help us to better satisfy a human need. And we've talked about the value subtracted from nature. But we've not talked about the kind of useless values. Talking with technologies, I've seen the other day that they are just, there's a channel, I think on YouTube, that is a 24/7 AI generated, unending random episode of Family Guy. It exists. I've seen they just invented a car that changed color, a bit like a chameleon. Right. I've seen, these machines where you just insert an avocado in it and then it tells you whether it's ripe or not. You have, of course, the ovens where you can connected oven with your phone so you can actually take videos of what you're roasting and post them on social media. I mean, these stuff, and then you imagine for each of these companies, you would have people doing the promotion, the marketing, the customer service, the design, all the cleaning, the cooking, and so David Graeber, when he writes his article in 2013, and then he receives a wave of message being like, "Look, I've got a bullshit job," because that was part of Graeber's definition. It needs to be self-evaluated. So only you know whether you have a bullshit job by asking yourself the question: if I were to just stop working, would that make a difference? If you're a nurse, if you're a farmer, if you're a bus driver, you would see a difference right now, like in the second. If you're the manager of a team of online referencing expert, part of the marketing team of a social media, and I'm not sure, you would stop working, anything would happen. So the concept of bullshit jobs means that there is such thing as bullshit growth. And that's not a term from Graeber, but I'm just extending his concept. All the work created, all the value created through bullshit jobs is useless and can be counterproductive. I mean, imagine how unpleasant it is today to open the web or to walk in the street and being assaulted by thousands of ads. So that's pollution in itself. All those little windows, pop-up windows you must close, all those little no cookies accepted, what or what, like that is making your life a tiny bit less enjoyable than it could be. But to have this required a tremendous amount of work. Every single ad we see and find annoying has been designed by people that had to go through a specific school to learn the art of marketing. And these people, they need to move to go to the office, they need to feed themselves, they need to organize. That office needs to be clean, needs to be financed, needs to be managed, all of that just for the creation of something that is making our daily life worse. So that's the very definition of bullshit growth, what Herman Daly, the American economist, was calling an economic activity. Something economic in the very concrete sense of the term is when you're being more efficient at doing something. You're not wasting resources, you're not wasting your time. Uneconomic growth is where you're adding layers of bureaucracy, of non-essentials goods and services, of defensive expenditures, useless insurances, things you need to buy to take care of the things you already have, things, storage spaces you need to buy just to store all the stuff you have that you don't use. So all these layers of accumulated economic fat, which we've seen are so nature intensive. So that's what makes it so much more catastrophic, is at least if we were eating the future and stealing the resources of the global south to make something absolutely amazing, something we would, every day look at and be like, we've built a pyramid of gold in the center of London and we love it, we absolutely love it. But no, we've been overshooting planetary boundaries through slightly larger cars. I don't even think people know a lot how heavy their cars are, and I don't think they care. If you were to turn their 2-ton SUV into a 1.7-ton SUV or into a 1.4 ton not SUV, I don't think most people would care as long as it's go from A to B. The SUV as a car category has been just created by marketing, and it has worked. I was making fun of Americans, of course, being like, well, it worked in the United States, surely it's not going to work in Europe. Well, I was wrong. Now in France, more than half of the cars being sold new are just heavy SUVs. So we've completely imported the heavy car culture of the US, which is so anti-progress, since the better technologies we have, the smaller we can make things. So now we can have this very tiny electric cars. They fit. They don't take much space. They don't take much resources. They're very energy efficient because they're so light. We can make them. We can make them so much more easily than it was 10 years ago or a century ago. But we decide not to. I mean, we car manufacturers decide not to, because there's more profit to be made in heavy luxury cars, which now people cannot afford to buy, and so they lease them. Another financial innovation, like you take a credit from the bank when you don't have money to be able to keep consuming. The leasing is what it was the solution of the car industry to be able to keep selling new cars, new larger cars, instead of just people using their old cars, or just buying a smaller, cheaper ones, or just transitioning to another mode of transport. But I'm sorry, that was a long diversion. Negative employment, that's not an interesting concept. I realized, because but behind there is something quite interesting. In the book, I say that economists have a very narrow vision of work. For them, you're either employed, meaning you are working within a company that's going to pay you, so it's wage labor most of the time, or you're going to be unemployed. And so unemployed is defined negatively as the absence of work, in the very same way that recession is defined negatively as the absence of growth. We actually call it negative growth. I mean, some of you guys that have done mathematics will find it strange. I mean, we call it negative growth. We love growth so much that, even when it's not happening, we still call it growth. And so I was like, but in the very same way that there are many different ways of imagining that downscaling, some actually very joyous. I mean, imagine if we were able to remove all the bullshit jobs. David Graeber, I mean, he never ran the study, but I think in his book, he estimated that was like 1/3 of the economy today was composed of bullshit jobs. So let's just, to honor him, let's just imagine that little number and be like, okay, so since that's either useless or uneconomic, we can just stop doing it and just reduce working time by 1/3. Imagine. I mean, would that not be the most revolutionary moment in modern economic history? In the matter of a year, we would manage to just reduce working time by 1/3. That would be just absolutely amazing. Our economy would get so much more performant, much more economic, much more efficient, much more parsimonious, because we evacuate the economic fat and then we liberate hours to do things. And that will be my last point. People will say, "Oh, but people won't get employed, or people will, get let," which is precisely what is an economy is here to do. I don't want to be unnecessarily provocative, but I will. An economy, raison d'être, is to destroy jobs. Think about it. If you run an economy and every year you have more and more work to do, I mean, there's nothing not working here. An economy is supposed to economize resources, human resources, natural resources. And so the more you run your economy and the more you better organize it, well, the higher standard of life you can have with the least amount of resources, including work. So that's also why, in the very long term, we've seen a reduction in average working time in the global north, which is great. We're not working 12 hours a day anymore, and I think we all celebrate this. The weird thing is, why did we stop doing this? And why is it not on the political agenda to work less? Work time reduction has turned into a radical demand for anarchists, whereas I think it should be the very first purpose of economic organization. Work time reduction, so more efficient use of human resources, and ecological sustainability, more efficient use of ecological resources.
And and just to go back to your digression, sorry, because I was very fascinated by that sort of list of almost of images of Family Guy running 24/7 on YouTube, the filming your oven or stuff like that. And so I'm going to connect from that to have a little bit of a digression here, because you say let's remove the bullshit jobs, and I suppose one question could be, isn't AI doing it in a way, or could AI do it? You mentioned, you say when every ad that we see, someone will have worked on it, and that's true. But then I'm not advocating for AI, by the way, at all. It's just, it made me think of another image that is weirdly similar to Family Guy 24/7 on YouTube, and it's this ad that I have been seeing recently here in London. I'm not going to name the company, obviously, but it basically says, "Stop hiring humans. Your AI employee is here." So I suppose my question is, do you think that maybe AI, in what I see as a tragic way anyway, is getting rid of the bullshit jobs or reducing the bullshit jobs?
Well, I'm going to try to start from a neutral start, saying that any technology, any choice of technology is always a trade-off we make. Very often it's a trade-off between, the human resource efficiency and then the ecological efficiency. And as we say, like, flying a plane allows you to accelerate greatly, but at a great ecological cost that we cannot afford anymore. And I think AI is very quickly going to run into these ecological barriers that will means that it's not we don't have a jockey card, meaning we can have an exponential growth in AI because it's just the new kid on the block. It's just technology like any other, and we need to look at its ecological footprint. The bullshit jobs, I mean, some of the tasks, I think it would be worse to replace them by AI, because AI will never be able to realize their bullshit task. The only salvation we have possible are these employees that one day wake up and be, I'm done, I quit. And they do, they do. To be like, well, I don't want to be that guy that is forced selling some scammy financial product to households and that come to the bank that don't need them. I mean, that's one of the job with the highest turnover. Like, I've been doing for a while, needed the money, but I won't do it. I won't do it. I take a moral stand against it. AI cannot take moral stand. So I think if for-profit businesses, which are instances that have been developed and are currently owners of AI, are just using that tool to increase the bullshification of the economy because it brings them a profit, then they will. And that will be a tragic issue. And then there's perhaps a broader reflection on AI, and then it's not my area of research, but I'm wondering what it will do to our collective critical thinking, our ability right now. I feel like, and I'm coming back to David Graeber because I'm such a fan. But David Graeber said, the way he was focusing on work time reduction was just not because it was lazy and just, a hedonist, which he was a hedonist, not lazy, but also because he realized that any sophisticated political organization requires time. And we don't have this time if we're spending, 50 hours a week working and then being completely tired after that, exhausted, that we cannot educate ourselves, we cannot read, we cannot talk. We're subdivided into different company cultures working in different places. And so imagine if we removed 1/3 of the working time, and half of that becomes political time people can just spend time reading about programs, discussing what they want to see happen in their city for municipal politics, having referendums, citizen assemblies, all these tools of participatory and deliberative democracy where people can just actually become active stakeholders of their own life instead of just being governed. So work time reduction is actually necessary for participatory democracy. And that's why it turns into what the anthropologist Jason Hickel calls a happy coincidence of degrowth. Like, the stuff we need to do for ecological reasons are actually silver linings for other things. Like, oh wow, we have to consume and produce less because we don't have energy and materials. But wait, that means we can afford to work less, which means we have more time to do stuff, including having a more revitalized and more participatory democracy. And in that sense, AI, because it's automating processes, it's evacuating, the uncertainty, the human kind of like yeah, I meet my neighbor, we discuss, we have this all weird ways, which I think we understand very well reading the anthropologist, the weird ways humans have to engage. And right now we are in a difficult situation that will require a lot of human engagement. I don't think there's a technical solution to it. I can tell you there is no technical solution to be awaited from economists. It's not a matter of having a powerful models. It's not a matter of having a powerful theories. It's a matter of finding enough time and a good setting where people are willing to discuss and change their minds together.
Thank you. And in a way, you said a lot of these people will, or we hope that one day these people will wake up or stand up against their, and take a moral stand against their bullshit job. And while obviously this is unfortunately not a choice available to a lot of people because you have to pay rent and bills, but then I've heard you talk about this idea of ethical sabotage. um, I don't know if does it relate to this idea of negative employment, or is it separate, do you think? And maybe do you want to maybe explain what you mean by ethical sabotage?
Yeah, it's in the conclusion of the book. I've titled it "Deserting Capitalism," and it comes from. I mean, there's a genealogy of Marxist strains around this. Let's stop making capitalism, and I think it rests on an important truth, which is the fact that the economy is just us making it every day. And this the critical mass movement, when they do a bike gatherings where they say, where people say, oh god, it's so annoying, you block the traffic. They say, we don't block the traffic, we are the traffic. And so that's exactly that kind of moment we should be having. Like, the economy is not just out there, it's just the economy is me going to work, is me choosing a bank, it's me putting money here and there, it's me deciding to do a specific school to get specific skills to have a specific job, it's me deciding, all these decisions. And I know I don't want to phase out inequalities, we don't have the same say, but there's still this critical mass aspect. Even when we look at the most extreme wealth inequality, for example, where we see that the upper decile possesses more than half of national wealth, but that's a very small number of people versus a critical mass of a lot of different people. A lot of these different people actually running the economy, like all the jobs that matter. And we saw that during COVID. All the managers and the CEOs and the CFOs, and these people, they're just, their presence is not absolutely necessary. Again, if you're a doctor or a nurse and there's a patient needing care, if you're not there, that patient is not going to be cared for. And so here we see that we are the economy. And then there's two geographers, which I'm also a long time fan, Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson. And they've written many books together, but one they published in 2013 is titled Take Back the Economy. It's a bit of a revolutionary manual to what kind of tools we can use as citizens to take back the economy. And that's precisely what we should do. Then this is so it's a bit of a fight club kind of mentality, where a lot of people, I think, are starting to realize that there's something wrong about capitalism, and they don't really know what to do about it. And I think a solution is obviously to connect these people, like it does in Fight Club. I'm of course not endorsing the explosion of banks or I spoiled the film. Damn, I'm going to be hated by the community. Well, anyway, watch it. It's a fantastic film and a great book. But everyone in its specific position, I think people can engage in daily act of resistance, and then grouping together can turn this red pill-inspired rage into collective creativity. Can be, what we've seen in France when people resist the building of a new airport and they occupy the land, and then they invent new ways of making decisions, and we see the formation of a fantastic little democratic commune, that it in what should have just been the extension of an airport to enrich investors that were already rich. So we see this critical rage is turning into creativity. And I'm just going to give you an example. I don't know if many of you are working at university, because again, I mean, I'm happy you said it, and we have very privileged professions. But even us, in all fields, there's a daily advancement of a capitalist encroachment into our life. And the one struggle that I'm really stuck on these days is the privatization of academic journals. Most people don't know about this, but most academic journals, so the very infrastructure we use to peer review and publish science, have been gradually appropriated by a handful, and when I say a handful, that's just really a handful, of gigantic for-profit corporations who are now extracting the most unfair rent in the modern history of capitalism. And so it would be weird as a anti-capitalist scholar to just keep doing my spiel and write the books and telling this, and then publishing my criticism of capitalism in journals being owned by for-profit corporations, which we need to pay for with public money, which is outrageous. So here we see, what can you do as an individual? Am I going to be, well, I'm not going to publish anything. As a scientist, that approach, which I've been taken in part, is not going to work very well. We can do something collectively. I'll just give you an example. With colleagues, we launched the Degrowth journal a few years back. We just said, we don't want degrowth as a radical concept. We don't want to publish this in for-profit commercial journals, and so therefore we created an editing collective, and a not-for-profit association that is running an open access journal. It wasn't difficult. It took some time, hence the need for work time reduction. Every time you want to modify the economy, you need time and human energy. But I feel right now we need to really take back the economy by, in each of our individual positions, which are sometimes very strategic, linking up and seeing how can we turn the nonsensical character of the present into a playing field for inventing a better economy.
Yes, and thank you so much for mentioning the privatization of academic journals, because I think it is a big issue. I know that it is in the UK. I'm sure it is in Switzerland and France as well. I am aware of time, so I'm not going to say anything, but I'm just going to ask you if you maybe want to say, just we have 5 minutes left before the Q&A. Do you maybe want to say something about your more recent research about post-growth in Switzerland?
Yeah, I can touch a word about this, and then I'll tell you just a tiny bit about the next book that will come out, the follow-up, Tom 2, Volume 2 of Slow Down or Die. So in Switzerland, what we're trying to do is really tackle the main obstacles of degrowth as a transition strategy. So as you can imagine, Switzerland has a massive macro ecological footprint, and also a massive national income and national wealth. And so it's a perfect candidate to be a guinea pig in trying to see what it feels to slow down your economy. Well, we're only working at university. There's no link with the Swiss government, so don't get too excited. But with models and various tools in the social sciences, we can still try to explore, first, the question that we've been working on during the first year of the project is, how big would be that degrowth? That's a simple question, but just how fast would be, how massive would be the slowdown? And would it be bigger than in Luxembourg or in Belgium or in Portugal or in France? How do we know? So we've been trying to design a method to calculate how big that degrowth is. And then, of course, what we're really interested in, once we know how big it is and we realize it's so transformative, what kind of policies do we have to make this a joyful, sustainable, fair, democratic transition and not a crash? So it's only been a year. We have 3 more to go, but our hope is to build frameworks that other people could then use in their own country to get a better sense of what the transition will look like and how can we prepare for it. Then on the book, because I know when you read Slow Down or Die, I don't know if that's your feeling or not, you feel like, well, there's a lot of critical theory. We invest a lot of time criticizing growth, and then you have, a little chapter on the transition, a little chapter on the utopia, and then it's gone. That was on design in the sense of Slow Down or Die is mostly the synthetic version of the first part of my PhD thesis, which was on the objection to growth, on the criticism of economic growth. And now part 2 of the thesis was on post-growth utopias. And now I'm working on a second book that will only be on that. So no critical theory about the present, or at least not much. No discussions about strategies and policies and transition stuff, just a raw exploration of what an alternative to capitalism will look like. Imagine a bit like a Jurassic World of post-capitalism. I want to build a park. I wish I could do a John Hammond imitation. I don't have that in me, but I want to build a park or a book where people could actually go and say, oh, wow, that's how health will be covered. That's how we will feed ourselves. That's how, the welfare state will be financed. And then from that journey into an hypothetical possible, you come back to the present and be like, wow, I would rather be living in that economy than in, advertising ridden, resource extractive capitalism we have. And when that will be done, there'll be a third book to finish the trilogy, which will be on transition strategies, very much based on the work I've been doing on Switzerland. Once this is done, I will finally retire. No, I'm joking, obviously. I'll keep publishing in for-profit commercial journals until capitalism gets the best of us.
That's amazing. I really like the Jurassic Park of post-capitalism. And in a way, I do hope that you get to retire after the third book, because if we talk about reducing how much time we spend working, I mean, and I do hope that once you retire, you keep doing what you like. But it's 3 p.m. here, so maybe I'm going to ask Leila if she can please switch the recording off and we can start the Q&A.
Yep, just doing that now.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have